Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is your Inept General bringing you another Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video, and today we are going to look at Throt the Unclean, this horrible creator of Skaven monstrosities. Now, Throt the Unclean is going to be making an appearance in the upcoming The Twisted and the Twilight DLC coming up on the 3rd of December. So we are going to be seeing him in-game very soon, so very excited for that. But for now, let's get on with the story of Throt the Unclean. Throt was born into Clan Moulder, based in Hell Pit, to the far north of the lands of Kislev. It's a clan that was known for creating monsters and selling them on to other Skaven clans to use in their armies. This task was mainly carried out by what are known as Packmasters, who were both in charge of these monstrous creations and were responsible for creating them themselves, using a mixture of Skaven magic and technology. And it was in this profession that Throt decided to specialize as a young, growing Skaven. He rose up through the ranks of Packmasters in very much a rat-eat-rat world, at times quite literally, and he fought many rivals to really reach the peak of Packmasterdom within Hell Pit. One of these rivals on his ascension to power got into a tussle with Throt and managed to bite out his eye. Now, exactly what happened to this rival, I don't think we're ever really told, but Throt, in a moment of perhaps madness or genius, or as perhaps more often than not in his case, a mixture of both, decided to take a piece of warpstone and hammer it into his empty eye socket. Now, for those of you who don't know, warpstone in the Warhammer world essentially condensed magic given physical form. Having a piece of warpstone hammered into his eye socket and perhaps touching on his brain cavity, as well as his prolonged exposure to warpstone, working in the forges of Hell Pit, creating these horrible monsters, they would often be exposed to a lot of warpstone, caused a lot of different changes to Throt's physical being. Some positive, some perhaps regarded as negative. For one, it gave him a monstrous strength as the warp energy traveled through his veins. He's said to be able to pin down a rat ogre with his tool Creature Killer. Now, this thing used to be called Mancatcher in the previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy, but I guess Games Workshop thought that was a little bit too thirsty, so they changed the name to Creature Killer. But this is the kind of enormous strength he can have in his limbs. This is the kind of enormous strength that this stout Skaven can display. In later editions, it was also said that the Warpstone was responsible for him mutating a third arm. In early editions, it said that he was born with this extra limb protruding from his side. Another mutation is that it caused bony spikes to erupt out of his skin from his vertebrae, going all along his head and back. Now, it also affected him mentally. It's said to have addled his mind both for good and bad. His kind of mad ingenuity, but it's also made him kind of insane. So maybe made him a bit smarter and made him a lot more insane, I think is kind of the effect that the Warpstone has been having on Throt's mind. Even affecting him in his sleep, where he's just haunted with these warp-corrupted visions of demented dreams. And these dreams plunge him just deeper into his insane delirium. So it's really not getting any better for Throt at this moment. If anything, he's going more insane as the days go on. The Warpstone has also ravaged his body's systems, and this has given him this ravenous hunger that he always needs to be eating. His metabolism is sped up. This is maybe what helps contribute to his strength, but he will have to eat 4 times his body weight, and he's a pretty heavy Skaven at that, every day just to maintain himself and keep himself going. To this end, he has pouches all around him filled with living creatures, worms, whatever vile things he can manage to concoct to help satiate his hunger, and he'll just delve his hands into there and just constantly be chewing. It's said that the moment he stops chewing, his mind starts to turn completely ferocious, and he can lose himself to the ravenous hunger and go mad and just consume whatever's around him, up to and including other Skaven, and even some of his own monstrous creations. He'll just gnaw on them until his hunger is satisfied, even for the briefest of moments. So this is really a debilitating aspect, but he tries to manage it as best he can. In terms of his day-to-day, Throt is consumed with his research, always trying to create the next monstrosity that will push Clan Moulder to the apex of Skaven society. Really just trying to hone his art and create the most destructive force possible for Skavendom to use. And he's aided in this quest because he's not hampered by, things that might limit other people's imaginations like sanity. So he can just go off the reservation with his ideas and really comes up with some of the craziest things Skavendom has ever seen. And, the lack of overall sanity, it means that mostly he's experimenting on living things. There's not a lot of anesthetic in the Skaven world, so his lab is just a horrible cacophony of tortured cries. I imagine a lot of things just wishing they were able to die, not enjoying the horrible monstrosities they've been turned into, the extra head attached onto the kneecap, being sewn into your brother who's on your back, all kinds of truly just horrendous experiments that Throt has been undertaking in his Skaven laboratory. Now, in order to sort of help his research go along, he has been known to travel the world a little bit, whether it be in search of new creatures to use in his experiments, or just to find new ways and new methodologies. During one of these trips, he's said to have traveled to Lustria and the dangerous jungles of the New World inhabited by all kinds of large and deadly lizards. There, he encountered Clan Pestilence and did a deal with them. They'd kind of share their knowledge, so they would teach their knowledge of diseases and corruption, and Throt himself would maybe help trade them or help them create their own monsters. And so he managed to learn a bit more about corruption and would be able to ingrain this Clan Pestilence corruption into a number of his creations going forward, including himself. In this research, it's claimed that maybe Throt the Unclean actually unleashed certain diseases around Skavendom, but he himself, due to his warp-enhanced physiology, has always been pretty resistant to these diseases. Although they will have an external effect on him, they're not necessarily affecting his day-to-day. They're not debilitating towards him in any way. When he returned from Lustria to the recesses of Hell Pit, it's probably thought he had a chat with his clan's leader, Lord Verminkin, and they both kind of came to the conclusion that what they needed is something the size of the monstrosities that he had seen in the lands of Lustria. Just huge creations that could cause all kinds of havoc to the enemies of Skavendom. And so the two of them set out trying to create something so large, Lord Verminkin, the leader of Clan Moulder, setting the whole clan to this task. Now, at first, no one could make anything of that size work. It was just too big. Things would fall apart. No one could manage to make a sustainable whole large monstrosity that could be this new weapon. Sort of a number of years passed, we presume. The experiments aren't working. They're spending an enormous amount of resources, an enormous amount of warpstone in making these huge monstrosities that are just falling apart, melting, fading into just agonized screams of pain as they sort of melt into a puddle. All kinds of horrendous things are happening in Clan Moulder. And that is when Throt, who had left for a little while to go into the Chaos Waste, comes back. And he comes back with something known as a blind worm. Now, this is in the year around 2480 of the Imperial calendar, so around 20 years before the start of the current Total War Warhammer timeline. Now, although this blind worm is huge, it's not particularly vicious in its own right, and they want to add on all kinds of extra bits and pieces, so they start to force feed this creature warpstone. It starts to grow even bigger, it starts to mutate, and then when they feel it's, nicely plump and ready for some really messed up stuff to happen to it, they start hitting it with warp lightning, and they start adding all kinds of other flesh components to it. Arms from Skaven, heads from rat ogres, all kinds of horrible things to see what will take. Now, it turns out that for some reason, the only things that would take to the blind worm were the components for rat ogres. So it was really just rat ogre stuff that they realized would stick and stay on to this creature that it could use and it would be able to function. So they start to stick it on, torture this creature consistently, hitting it with lightning, force-feeding it warpstone every day. Must have just been a hellish existence. for this poor, massive creature. Then, one day, their great work had been finished. They just needed to jolt all the different components they'd sewn onto the creature back in action. And one evening, where Morisleb, the green moon of the Warhammer world, hung low in the sky, the winds of magic blew strongly, the Skaven of Hell Pit summoned down warp lightning and breathed life into the first ever Hell Pit abomination. The creature went into a frenzy. It rampaged around the labyrinthian Hell Pit, slaughtering Skaven by the hundreds, if not the thousands, as it made its way through its corridors. Eventually, Throt and the other Packmasters managed to bring the beast under control, and Lord Verminkin, the leader of Clan Moulder, was greatly pleased, and instantaneously started devising plans with Throt the Unclean to make many, many more of these monstrosities. This was the creature that Clan Moulder had been looking for. Throt had managed to achieve what they'd been looking to do. He'd made this true monstrosity that could change the balance of power within Skavendom itself. And as a reward, Lord Verminkin gave him sort of the best chambers in Hell Pit next to his own in the sort of labyrinthian tunnels. He gave him a number of breeders as well, so that Throt the Unclean could reproduce. But these were by no means the first breeders. He'd achieved many things in his long, long life. Now, it's said that through his use of Warpstone, Throt had actually managed to extend his life beyond that of any normal Skaven. He, in fact, was the second oldest Skaven in the whole of Clan Moulder after Lord Verminkin himself. And this had given him the opportunity to actually have a lot of kids. He'd had a lot of litters, and this has made him something of a patriarch within Clan Moulder. He's had so many children, and their children have had children. In fact, you'd be kind of hard-placed to find someone who didn't have some kind of blood tie with Throt the Unclean within Clan Moulder itself. But, you know, in Skavendom, there's very little affection for your children. People barely know who their children are. And this is kind of the same with Throt. He's known to have killed many of his offspring. Some just, you know, they got in the way or for experiments. And some because they just tried to rival his power and go against him. So there's no kind of sentimentality or familial connections in the heart of Throt the Unclean. Having mastered creating this enormous monstrosity for Clan Moulder, they kind of started to establish it and make more Hell Pit abominations themselves. And so Throt turned his mind to the next great challenge. Now, for many, many years, the biggest export for Clan Moulder were their rat ogres, a great weapon of war that were used by many other of the Skaven clans who always bought them from Clan Moulder. Now, the issue was, rat ogres are pretty dumb. They're not very intelligent. They can't do a lot. So Throt set himself to try and solve this problem, to make them more efficient fighting machines by giving them a modicum of intelligence. Now, we can presume that he experimented in all kinds of ways to give rat ogres intelligence. And one of these experiments took the form of Gorich. Now, Gorich was a lieutenant or general in Archeon's army. He led a foolhardy attack against an Empire artillery train, and his tribe, who were probably devoted to Khorne, if I'm going to guess, as he was a berserker and ran headlong into a barrage of artillery fire with his entire tribe, got annihilated. It was a lot of blood for the blood god on that day. But Archeon kind of had counted on their troops for later engagements and really got kind of miffed at Gorich. And so he had his berserker shackled and wrapped in ropes of thorns, and then delivered him to the Skaven of Clan Moulder, probably knowing full well the horrors that would await him within. And when he arrived with the other slaves into Hell Pit himself, Throt immediately recognized his fantastic fighting stock, and so selected him out of the slaves to be subject to his experiment. And Throt, in a moment again of genius and a slight bit of insanity, put the mind of a berserker Norscan into the body of a rat ogre, and it took. Gorich awoke to find himself an augmented rat ogre with his intelligence preserved. In shock and probably enraged at what had befallen him, the berserker started to press against his restraints, eventually snapping them. He tore his way out of Throt's laboratory, fighting his way through level upon level of Hell Pit, eventually working his way into the very center of the arena in Hell Pit, where they would hold their blood sports. Throt, trying to control this new creation of his, sent many of his more tame creations after it to try and bring it back. But Gorich had the mind of a berserker, and in a frenzy, he started to tear Throt's creations apart piece by piece. The other master molders in Clan Molder noticed what was going on in the arena, and the spectacle drew quite an audience. This was clearly an individual of fantastic killing prowess and could be hugely helpful in helping maintain order among the ranks of Clan Molder's more wild creations. And so it was decided that this berserker rat ogre crossbreed would be spared and in fact have the opportunity to climb the social ladder within Clan Molder itself, eventually rising to the rank of chieftain and taking over many of the armies of Lord Verminkin and Clan Molder, leading them into glorious battle. Now, Throt was not particularly happy with this, as Gorich began to get the attention of Lord Verminkin. Lord Verminkin began to elevate Gorich to lead many of his armies, and this enraged Throt. He did not want to make a rival for political power, something that grew beyond his control. He just wanted to try and make rat ogres a bit more intelligent. And so although Throt was the creator of Gorich, he does kind of keep him at arm's length and distrusts the Norscan berserker in the rat ogre body. Now, we are going to get to see Gorich in the upcoming DLC, the Twisted and the Twilight, so that will be fun to see their relationship play out. Now, it is maybe worth making a small note here that the story of Gorich isn't actually mentioned in any of the army books. In fact, I think he appeared in an issue of White Dwarf when they were highlighting somebody's created army, and I think Creative Assembly has just run with the idea of it. Now, it's a fun idea, but in terms of him being sort of mainline canon, there are some questions about it. So I thought I'd include him in this, as he is making an appearance in Total War Warhammer, but just maybe something for you guys to keep in mind at home. But what this experiment did do, in effect, was manage to take Throt back to the drawing board. It was like, okay, this is not the way we are going to bring intelligent rat ogres. I don't want another one of these crazy human rat ogres running around, usurping my positions, and perhaps making me not necessarily the favorite of the Lord of Clan Molder anymore. So he kind of went back to the drawing board and thought, how can we make rat ogres intelligent? He tried the idea of using volunteers and sewing them onto the back of rat ogres, allowing them to tap into each other's nervous system, giving the rat ogres a second brain, effectively. Now, although he did get this to work, it was kind of horrible, and there weren't many volunteers to be sewn onto the back of a rat ogre for the rest of their lives. So, that failed a bit. So he took that, decided to start breeding his own kind of Skaven, who were all very scrawny of body, very submissive, would do whatever they were told, and so the bodies would eventually be sewn onto the rat ogres. The bodies would atrophy and kind of fade away, almost leaving this head by itself. And this is where it kind of got interesting. He was able to put these in canisters, protect them, and effectively gave rat ogres a second head. Now, it worked. Actually, better than expected. Not quite as good as Gorich. They weren't quite as smart as that, but it allowed rat ogres to do things they'd never been able to do before, and this included using complicated weaponry. The problem was, Clan Molder didn't really have that much weaponry. I mean, a rat ogre with a big stabby knife with a brain and a rat ogre without a big stabby knife with a brain are only marginally more effective. There were better uses for these creatures, Throt thought to himself, and he began to rack his mind, and he knew if there was one place to go for weaponry in Skaven society, it was to Clan Skryre, the technological geniuses of the Skaven world. These guys provided the most complex and deadly weaponry that the Skaven Empire had to offer. And so Throt goes to Clan Scryer and says, look, I've got these smart rat ogres, what can you do for them? And there he teamed up with Ikit Claw, the legendary lord we've had in the game for some time now. I'm not going to delve into Ikit's full lore. If you'd like to know that, do check the top right hand corner now. It'll be popping up, or there'll be a link to Ikit's lore video in the description below. But he is a master engineer, and he started to strap on some of these weapons he'd been working on for ages, but were too heavy for like individual or even teams of Skaven to carry around by themselves. And so they found their marriage in heaven, and they created what would become known as stormfiends, just deadly killing rat ogres with enhanced weaponry that could devastate ranks and ranks and ranks of enemy troops. And lo and behold, Throt had done it again, truly made a leap and a bound in the advancement of the Skaven war machine. And this is kind of where we find Throt the Unclean at this point. Perhaps he hasn't even in the Total Warhammer world invented Stormfiends yet, that might come a bit later, but this is where we find him. Now, in terms of his rules on the tabletop and how they might translate into Total War Warhammer, we have the rule of Master Controller, which on the tabletop allowed him to have a leadership buff to any of his monsters, sort of like rat ogres, wolf rats, giant rats, stuff like that. Anything that would potentially be a clan molder creation, he gave a leadership buff to at an extended range than a regular pack master would. He also had Ravening Hunger, this is a rule where he would basically have to take a leadership test, and if he failed the leadership test, he'd have to eat one of the models in his own unit. So this could be a Skaven, or it could at times even be a full rat ogre. So you'd lose a full rat ogre on the tabletop potentially by Lord Throt getting hungry and eating it on the battlefield. So that was always a fun rule for Throt the Unclean there. He also has, of course, in terms of his weaponry, he has his Creature Killer, stroke Man Catcher, and that had Killing Blow and would do a lot more wounds than a regular weapon. So you'd probably see that translated as a higher weapon strength. And Killing Blow is a thing that a number of units have in Total War Warhammer already, so we'll probably see that translation as well. His other weapon is his Whip of Domination. Now, this is a whip made of Minotaur hide cured in troll digestive juices. And it is basically a whip that scares people. It's the Whip of Domination. It lowers their leadership, so that would be kind of a fear-inducing buff or just a lowering leadership buff, perhaps, in Total War Warhammer. As I said at the beginning, we are going to get Throt the Unclean in the upcoming Twisted and the Twilight DLC. Can't wait to have him in a game. It'll be a very different experience playing up in Hell Pit than perhaps any other Skaven spot. A lot of chaos, some dwarves to fight, some Kislev to fight. So, you know, it could be a very interesting new game experience there. And we are going to get a whole bunch of new mechanics in terms of stuff he can do in his lab for Throt the Unclean in the new DLC. But I can't wait for Throt to be in the game. Let me know what you guys think. Alright guys, thanks for listening, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, bye.